Welcome friends to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock flavoured podcast. On this show, we're fully into the Halloween period and, following a tradition established in the last year or three, we're putting our feet to the pedal and ensuring a full spooky slate. When Allister was last on the show, Allister Thompson, aka The Gateless Gate, aka Carn Tengri, aka Sons of Birches, and many more, author of The Music of the Spheres and soon to be unveiling his second novel. Last time he was in Derry and Tom's, we talked about the Moorcock and James Cawthorne scripted film adaptation of The Land That Time Forgot. And on that show, we touched very briefly upon what we are here to discuss today, a book that has featured on past Halloween polls here at Breakfast in the Ruins, but has never received the required tally. So this year, as Allister expressed an interest, I thought it was time to leave it off the poll options and just dive in anyway. We're here to talk about William Hope Hodgson's The House on the Borderland. Hodson was a fascinating character, only writing 5 novels in his time as an author, when he wasn't a sailor, photographer, physical culturist, tormentor of Houdini, or soldier in World War I, the final year of which sadly saw his demise at the age of 40 at the 4th Battle of Ypres. He also wrote many poems and short stories, often nautically themed and shot through with supernatural under- or overtones. He was the creator of Karnaki, the ghost detective, a character that's popped up in popular culture from time to time over the decades in such media as the 1970s ITV anthology show The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, where he was played by Donald Pleasance, and Alan Moore's The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Hodgson was out of print for decades following his death in 1918, other than some reprints in the early 20s, but found an audience again in the 50s thanks to August Dale as Arkham House publisher and his championing by H.C. Koenig. And again in the 60s, 70s and 80s thanks to the paperback boom, with various publishers and writer-editors like Lynn Carter promoting his writings. Today, as his work is in the public domain, you can find most of it online digitally, or in a wide variety of editions, the best these days being those by Nightshade Press, and, in the case of The House on the Borderland, the wonderful Swan River Press edition. Lovecraft was an admirer of Hodgson, but so were many other high-profile authors of that time, and more than a few more modern authorities, such as Brian Stableford. But in a 1944 issue of Koenig's The Reader and Collector fanzine, legendary fantasist and poet Clark Ashton Smith wrote of Hodgson. Among those fiction writers who have elected to deal with the shadowlands and borderlands of human existence, William Hope Hodgson surely merits a place with the very few that inform their treatment of such themes with a sense of authenticity. His writing itself, as Mr. Lovecraft justly says, is far from equal in stylistic merit, but it would be impossible to withhold the rank of master from an author who has achieved so authoritatively, in volume after volume, a quality that one might term the realism of the unreal. In some ways, Hodgson's work is no doubt most readily comparable to that of Algernon Blackwood, but I am not sure that even Blackwood has managed to intimate a feeling of such profound and pervasive familiarity with the occult as one finds in The House on the Borderland. Hideous phantoms and unknown monsters from the Nightwood Gulf are adumbrated in all their terror, with no dispelling of their native mystery, and surely such things could be described only by a seer who has dwelt overlong on the perilous verges, and who has peered too deeply into the regions veiled by invisibility from normal sight. However, The House on the Borderland, though probably the most sustained and least faulty of Hodgson's volumes, is far from being his most unique achievement. In all literature, there are few works so sheerly remarkable, so purely creative, as The Nightland. Whatever faults this book may possess, however inordinate its length may seem, it impresses the reader as being the ultimate saga of a perishing cosmos, the last epic of a world beleaguered by eternal night and by the unvisageable spawn of darkness. Only a great poet could have conceived and written this story, and it's perhaps not illegitimate to wonder how much of actual prophecy may have been mingled with the posy. It is to be hoped that work of such unusual power will eventually win the attention and fame to which it is entitled. Beyond doubt, accident and fatality play a large part in such matters, and many meritorious books and works of art are still shadowed in obscurity. Hodgson, though little known, is in good company. How many, even among fantasy lovers, have heard of the great imaginative artist, John Martin, or the equally great and macabre imaginative poet, Thomas Lovell Beddoes? High praise indeed from Ashton Smith there. And we'll touch on the Nightland too as we go along. It's an interesting experience. So, barricade your doors against intruders from the abyss, and light a lamp by which you may find solace in your trusty hound, while you contemplate the loneliness of eternity. Or, just put the kettle on and have a brew, and join Allister and me as we explore The House on the Borderland. We are back in Derry and Tom's, and we have Allister Thompson back. Welcome back, Allister.
Thank you very much, Andy. Happy to be here, as always.
What news? What news in Allisterville?
I mean, personally, me and my various doings. Well, I still await the publication of my second sci-fi-ish novel, which is supposed to be out in, I believe, spring of 2025. So we're getting there. It's been a long wait, but hopefully it'll be worth it. And I've just released a vast compilation of all of my best tracks that I'm calling a box set, because there's 60 of them on my Bandcamp, because I'm going on a bit of a musical hiatus to focus on the writing thing, because there's only so many hours in the day. Get back to writing fiction, some of the music writing I used to do. So I'm going out with a bang, with a grandiose little compilation. So everybody get on there and download that, please. It's free.
Jolly good, and that's available through gatelessgate at bandcamp.com.
That's correct.
Gatelessgate.bandcamp.com. Yeah.
That's right. And it's called Ethereally Obscure is the title of my compilation.
Well, I encourage everybody to check it out. So there's actually a connection between what we're going to talk about today, which I think people who, if they listen to the Land That Time Forgot episode, will have had an advanced hint about. But there's a connection between what we're talking about today and your new novel, because, of course, we're going to talk about William Hope Hodgson's 1908. How would you just... Well, we'll get to that in a second. It's a weird one, but it's a good one.
It is.
His 1908 opus, The House on the Borderland. Now, how did you come across this book, or did you come across Hope Hodgson first, or did you come across Hope Hodgson and this book at the same time? How did you happen across this author?
I came across the book because it's by far his most famous piece of work, but I cannot remember. It was probably something, not very interesting, like I saw it on social media. Who knows, maybe you shared something about it back in the days when Twitter was functional. Yeah. But I'm a fan of early weird fiction, sort of the early fantasy sci-fi stuff from the first couple of decades of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Those eccentrics who would write these, sometimes even just one-off, but these absolutely zany mental novels that are just works of genius that nobody would ever have published in subsequent decades. They just sort of, they got away with it. And Hope Hodgson, he actually wrote, for a living at one point. So he doesn't really fit into that necessarily, the lonely eccentrics. But there was, these things you just don't come across things like that anymore. Well, actually you do, because I work with a lot of self-published authors, so yes, I do. But they're not as good as those older ones for the most part. But anyway, I have an attraction to that kind of thing. My all-time favorite is A Voyage to Arcturus by David Lindsay from that oeuvre. But this is a close second, I think. So I don't remember exactly how I came across it, but when I did, I was very impressed by the intensity of this thing right away. It's very, very, very intense, as we'll discuss.
Yeah. I've actually got Voyage to Arcturus on the shelf as well, the very copy that I got off Pops back in the day when I was a kid, one of that massive array of books that I picked up as a teenager, but I've never read it. So it's one of those few that I got off him, but for whatever reason, and I can't tell you why, it's never actually made it to the top of my to-read pile. So I've had Voyage to Arcturus for probably 37 years or more, kicking around my book collection.
It will change your life in some indescribable way that you don't understand.
Well, if you're game for it, we'll cover that in the new year.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt your thought there about it.
No, it's cool. We're actually at that stage of the year now where we can start to say what we'll do in the new year. I think October the 1st seems to be a fairly arbitrary but reasonable demarcation of time where you can start saying, right, in the new year, we'll look at A, B, and C. But yeah, Voyage to Arcturus is definitely one that I need to visit. Yeah, Hope Hodgson. Fascinating character. You talk about some of these weird individual characters who produced interesting output, over 100 years ago. It was because who was he? He was the son of a clergyman, ran away to sea at 14. Shortly afterwards, his father died. Seemed to channel a lot of guilt about that into a lot of his stories, a lot of his writing. This was his second novel. I think he wrote this when he was in his early 30s, and then he wrote tons and tons and tons of nautical fiction, many, many short stories, 5 novels, and then when World War One came around, he, even as a man in his late 30s, he was too old for the draft, but he volunteered, got an injury, was sent home, then volunteered to go back and got blown to pieces in 1918. On top of that, he had a whole host of strange interests that I don't think the word bodybuilding had been created by then, but there was a specific expression for it that he used, which I forget. But he was into, essentially, he was an early bodybuilder who took a really scientific approach. And when Harry Houdini was touring Britain, he would put himself in places where he would say, right, somebody tie me up. And one of his tricks was that he would, get out of any knot or anything like that. And he and his representatives accused William Hope Hodgson of cheating because Hope Hodgson held the record for tying Harry Houdini up, and it took him the longest to escape from it. An exhibition that Houdini did in Bolton.
So you do not come across biographies like that anymore, do you?
No.
You just don't.
It's absolutely fascinating. And I first came across him because, well, naturally, like most of these bloody things, through the Sphere edition of House on the Borderlands, because I picked it up off Pops, and this is the Sphere edition with that striking Terry Oaks cover of the swine beast looming above the house with somebody illuminated from behind in the window. Now, this isn't the actual copy that I got off Pops because, I mean, I love that copy and I cherished it. And this speaks of Pops to me straight away the moment I pick it up or look at it for a couple of reasons. But our dog chewed it up. We had a young puppy, and Bella, and she chewed it to pieces. And when I first got together with Phil, I think we used to have kitchen hangouts where we'd get drunk and listen to music and smoke because we were smokers at the time. But we would never smoke in our living room or our lounge or anything like that. We would only smoke in the kitchen with the window open. So I probably very weepily reminisced about Pops and all the books and mentioned this book and that it got chewed up. And then my following birthday, she gave me this pristine copy of the Sphere edition of House on the Borderlands in a plastic wrapper, which I'm going to put it back in now because it's very, very dear to me, even though it's not the actual edition.
Now that's a partner who understands you.
Absolutely, yeah, she absolutely does. I got the right one by hook or by crook. But over the years, I've picked up numerous other editions of it as well. I'll sort that out later because I'm actually going to fuck it up if I don't get careful. Picked up numerous other editions over the years, and this is another one that I can't remember whether Phil or my mate Yaki got me this one for Christmas, because Yaki is also a similar age. Well, he's a year younger than me, but also has a fascination with this book. This is another cover that I absolutely love. Now, this is absolutely hopeless, of course, for podcast listeners because they have no fucking idea what we're talking about. But this is Ace Science Fiction Classics from the 1960s. And it's actually got a cover that's representative of the contents too, because it's the jade, like, effigy of the house in the middle of the plain, which we'll get to, with the black sun looming overhead and the recluse astrally projecting below it with all of the weird godlike figures arrayed around the mountainside. I also like the back. Authentic goose flesh in those big 60s, wonderful 60s fonts. Now, the reading copy I'm going from actually is the worst cover I've ever seen from it, but it's the one I had to hand and the one I didn't mind flicking through and potentially, wearing a little bit. For some reason, this one's got a huge piece of a huge cob of corn.
Yeah. It's on the cover. They thought it was in Mesoamerica or something.
Yeah. Yeah, so the house on the Borderland in this one is like some kind of Midwest farm in the Dust Bowl. And there's a huge piece of corn.
It says H.P. Lovecraft in very large letters. Yes. Much larger than Hodgson's name.
So that authentic goose flesh is a quote from Lovecraft. Yeah.
So I guess that was when Lovecraft was having his big posthumous renaissance with hippie readers.
This is a Manor Books edition from 1977. Manor Books, incidentally, the publishers of the Danus books. #fucking Danus, if anybody's listening who's into that stuff. I think in terms of modern editions, I think the ones to go for, though, are the Swan River Press edition, which is something of a beauty. It's got an intro by Alan Moore and an outro by Ian Sinclair, who's a very interesting author.
If I could just interject, though,
yeah.
if I could just interject, for North Americans might think that the pig man on the cover of that resembles the sitcom character Alf from the 1990s. It looks exactly like Alf. So maybe Alf was one of the pig men.
You know, that didn't even occur to me. Okay, maybe not the greatest
He
cover.
was very abusive to the father on that sitcom, as I recall. So he was much like the pigman. I digress. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, if you do get this one, just take, and you don't like having Alf on the cover, take the cover off, because you've got a beautiful John Coulthard designed.
That is nice.
Cover on the hardback. And the other ones that are potentially worth chasing down. Now, Nightshade Press did a collected series of 5 volumes of all of Hope Hodgson's work, and this is the House on the Borderlands edition.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And it's an absolute beauty. It also contains all the Karnaki stories and a whole host of other short stories. Unfortunately, these gorgeous hardcover editions now, I only managed to get 3 of the 5. They go for stupid money now because they're out of print. I think the Ghost Pirates goes for about 500 quid. This one goes for something over 200. But on the positive note, they have been reprinted in paperback, which are easily and commonly available. So, yeah, I have something of a thing for editions of The House on the Borderland. The
version that I read, I don't know if I still have my copy, had a different cover again. I can't remember what it was. It was sort of a landscape. I can't remember. Anyway.
Yeah, when you look it up online, there are so many different editions now, and of course, because it's in the public domain,
right?
Pretty much anybody can knock out
Speaking
copies.
of that, you know what I have when I reread this? You know, the Delphi editions. It's one of those publishing companies that gathers together public domain stuff. So you can get the Delphi Arthur Macon, you can get the Delphi Ashton Smith. So I have the Delphi Hope Hodgson, and so it's it's about 20,000 pages long or something on an e-reader, but I can just go. You can go on the tablet and read it there. So that was handy.
Yeah, one of the great things about things being in the public domain is just how easily available they are. I mean, what was it? What was the project?
It's Gutenberg that has all of this stuff.
Yeah. Now, you're an author. You're a professional editor in your day job as well. So this is an unusual book.
Yes.
How would you pitch this book to someone, particularly someone who is unaware of Hope Hodgson, as like an elevator pitch?
Well, it's a classic work of cosmic existentialist horror. And that's how I would, because it is related very much to, and no doubt Lovecraft was influenced by Hope Hodgson. There's no way he wasn't.
Yeah.
But, it's similar to in intent and intensity, and sometimes even in the way it's written in terms of language choices. There's back then there was no editors telling you don't write purple prose. So these guys got away with a lot. But that would be the way I would put it. If you like, that in the intensity of cosmic horror, cosmic awe, that's really what this thing is all about, right?
Yeah. Now, the problem with this Man of Books version is it's missing the opening poem, To My Father, whose feet tread the lost aeons. And sorry, just going back to Lovecraft for a second, that Lovecraft quote on the cover of the Sphere edition is another thing that kind of leapt at me when I first saw this. It had that Lovecraft quote from Supernatural Horror in Fiction, where he described it as a classic of the first water.
Right.
And I remember reading that and think, what the fuck does that even mean? Yeah. But I guess HPL.
So I guess he was. I was just speculating that he was a fan, and obviously he was because of all these pull quotes they used.
Yeah. So it opens with a poem. It says, "To my father, whose feet tread the lost aeons, open the door and listen. Only the wind's muffled roar and the glisten of tears round the moon, and in fancy the tread of vanishing shoon out in the night with the dead. Hush and hark to the sorrowful cry of the wind in the dark. Hush and hark without murmur or sigh, to shoon that tread the lost aeons, to the sound that bid you to die. Hush and hark, shoon of the dead." Interesting little poem. Apparently shoon means shoes. Well, there you go. That's handy. I had to look that up. I was like, what the fuck is he talking about when it comes to shoon?
Dutch or something.
Yeah, it opens with a nice little poem. an ode to his father, essentially. This is going to get really annoying, but I'm now getting to the point with some of these books that I need to wear my reading glasses. Whereas if I have my reading glasses and stare at the screen, everything's blurry. So I'm going to be constantly... I need to get bifocals, I think, but this
Oh, I have those.
Yeah, this could become a problem. So let's get down to this book then. So Hodgson was fond of certain, I don't know, would we describe them as literary devices? I don't know. There's like a double framing device in this. One that's quite common, first up, and we talked about it with the Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff. Author receives or obtains manuscript of mysterious stuff. Yes. And says, I am presenting to this to you, the reader, and he positions himself as the curator, the editor of this strange account. And we did talk about, but this predates Princess of Mars by 4 years, as it's from 1908. I'm sure there will be earlier examples in genre fiction, but this is a pretty early example of that, nevertheless, in my experience. I'm not sure how many other examples there are. I'm sure there are some, probably.
I've come across fiction. Many. Yes, for sure.
And, even stuff like, I think Rudyard Kipling did it a little bit with The Man Who Would Be King, even though he's kind of taking a direct account from, is it Peachy, isn't it? Because the other one's been killed. I can't remember. It's a long time since I read that. So it is a thing, but also it's a thing that would go on to be a really, really big thing in this kind of fiction. And this is an early example of Hope Hodgson getting in on the act. But there's a second layer added to it with these tourist-struck camper fellas with the strange names. What are the names?
I think what it does is it grounds the opening in a reality and puts you in the place of the protagonist. So you become that POV. And I think it's supposed to, emphasize the strangeness of what follows in the account, right? Because you were seeing things through mundane eyes, and it's like, oh, but there's actually this whole layer of reality that's going to be revealed through this account. So I think that's really the reason for it. Yeah.
And these two guys with a very strange names, Tonison and Beregnog, which, curious choices. Tonison, okay, fair enough. Beregnog, that's quite an unusual one. And also, there's so these two guys find the ruins of a house on the west coast of Ireland, and the remains of this old edifice kind of tower above a precipice, above a ravine, with a subterranean river or stream at the bottom which exits and then re-enters the rock deep below. And they find a manuscript kind of embedded in the remains of a wall, and they set camp and begin to read it. And then it begins, and once again I think it does have a Hope Hodgson favourite, especially when you think about something like the Nightland, where he picks a slightly shonky and odd technique that by gum he sticks with throughout. Because even though this is supposedly a manuscript written by somebody and found in a wall, every paragraph starts with quotation marks, although it's as though it's somebody recording speech, which is slightly odd and at first slightly distracting, as if someone else is recording this recluse's account. But I kind of found it distracting at first, but you just sort of get used to it quite quickly. And we know, if you've ever read The Nightland, just how deeply Hodgson could go into a chosen style if he felt that it fit. If it fit what it was trying to convey.
There's nothing like it. We'll get to that.
While we're in, I've got my copy of The Nightland here, my Nightshade copy of The Nightland.
That's not. I thought it would be bigger.
Well,
is it small print or something?
Yeah, most of these volumes are... I've got the Sphere edition up there, it's ginormous. Most of these volumes are usually one novel and a million short stories. This one is just purely The Nightland with fairly tiny text. Yes. And I would say 95% of the paragraphs in The Nightland start with "and." Like it's a stream of consciousness.
Yes.
And the read along the lines of this... And you do now perceive something roughly how the land did seem to back my part, and unto my left, and somewhere before my face. And because that I did think to have no profit for my search, that if I went to the left, I made attention unto the right. And here there was much of darkness, yet oft the shining of fire holes in this place, and that amid the darkness. And as I did look, it grew very plain upon me how great was the spread and drear wideness of that country of night, and how that I did be an utter lonesome person in all that dark. And so shall you be, with me in sympathy of the utter greatness of my task, and know of the fear that did breed odd wiles, that I should search until I die, and never find, and you to give me good human understanding. And there's about 500 fucking pages of these paragraphs.
And what's interesting about that is it's a completely different style than he had written in before. It's like he just decided, I'm committing to this for this project. And it's just so very strange. I mean, we can see why he chose that. Because he was trying to write an epic, on the scale of Milton or something. But it's just, it's tough sledding, as they say.
It takes some commitment to get through this. And I did finish it once, probably in my 20s.
I finished it last year.
Yeah. And it takes a great deal of commitment. But what a fucking fantastic idea this book is. Because essentially,
are we going there now? Or is it,
let's do it. What is the Nightland about?
Well, the Nightland is, as I said, an attempt to write an epic, a true epic, a deeply, deeply flawed one that is 200,000 words long. But it's part of probably one of the first dying Earth stories, of any length. And the premise is that we're at the end of the Earth's history. Everything is black all the time. The sun's burned out. The last remaining humans live in a giant city that they can't leave. It's one big building and it goes underground and they're all there. And outside, mysterious entities have descended from space of various kinds. And they, for some reason, they wish ill on the humans. And they, you can't go outside. I don't know what they'll do. They'll steal your soul or eat you, or it's never really all that specified. And in that, the premise is our hero, who can communicate through some device telepathically over the airwaves, receives a message from another city that they didn't know about, where there's a young woman requesting help because these entities are about to overrun their city. And the conceit where things get ridiculous is he somehow realizes she's a reincarnation of someone he was in love with during the medieval period of Earth's history. And so there's a long preface, a prologue that you can barely get through before this whole thing starts about these two characters. And so then he goes on a quest to rescue her through this nightmare landscape. And so up to about 100,000 words, once you get used to the way he's writing it, you can kind of get into it because it's very inventive and very atmospheric. It's the last 100,000 words after he rescues her where things really, really go awry, because not only does it reverse that exact same journey, but with the same things mentioned, but he's accompanied by this woman, and the relationship between him and the woman is what we would consider today to be extremely inappropriate and deeply, deeply abusive. But he's positioning this as an example of perfect courtly love. That's the example that he's using. But it's just, there's parts of it where you think, why am I putting myself through this? Like this feels wrong to read this, because the girl is, even though they're wandering through a nightmarish landscape and he has to carry her much of the time, she will occasionally be, as he calls it, naughty. She's acting out like a small child, and then he must correct her, which we must assume means that he's beating her back into submission so that she'll behave and allow him to save her life. So this happens, like everything in this novel, it happens multiple times. Yeah. Everything that happens in this novel happens over and over again. Yeah. It needed, and I know that you've told me there was an edition that someone has prepared that was sort of a abridged version where somebody tried to condense it. Yeah. But he really, really needed the benefit of a very vicious editor to get this thing into shape. But it's one of those things on a lesser scale than House on the Borderland or A Voyage to Arcturus or Last and First Men or books like that. It's a lesser, but it's still a very spectacular example of a man's completely unfurled imagination and ambition. And that's why I decided, I liked his other work and I decided to try that. Once I realized what I was dealing with, I said, okay, well, this is not going to be worthwhile, but I'm going to do it. Yeah. And actually, there are some passages in it that are so striking that I've used one of them as the epigraph for my upcoming novel. So even though I don't really like the Nightland, there was a passage in there that was perfect to express what I was saying in my own novel. And so I felt despite what I just described to you about, what happens in the second half of the Nightland.
Yeah.
I decided that, I would use that as an epigraph. So if the House in the Borderland is sort of the highlight of Hodgson's career, then the Nightland is sort of the nadir in some ways. But because it was just free, completely free expression, and that's why we like those kinds of books. It's still worth it for the lover of weird fiction. So that's my take on the Nightland.
Yeah, so there is somebody out there who has done that. They've tried to modernize the language and abridge it and condense it and severely edit it. But there's a couple of paragraphs here that sum up pretty much my entire memory of the second half of this book. And it says, "And presently mine own maid did loose herself gentle from me, and washed me, and tended me, and very hushed and tender, and something down-riddled of her dear and lovely eyes. And then we to eat, and to drink together, and joy so great and quiet did be upon us, and that it did be as that we had gone into an eternity of peace and utter concern. And surely as the thought did stare in me, it did be of beauty that we did be both of us true unto the other in that life, and I never have to kissed a maid until that I kissed mine own, and she to have been likewise, and to have fended all men from her, because that they did be strangers unto her inwardness, and so we two be so utter together, both in our spirits did be knit, being each the complement of the other, and because that we had no secret pains of remembered things to set any apartness between our hearts." It's like an incel, and some woman at a coffee shop spoke to them, and they speak about them as mine own for the next 5 years.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a romantic, and I believe you probably are too, but this is too much.
It really is. And there's like hundreds of pages of this.
He just
in the
doesn't know when
half.
to stop.
No.
His idea of what perfect true love is very, if that represents his ideal, is very strange. And I know what the sources of it, and in terms of, literature and culture, but it, even in the I think it was 1912 or whenever he wrote that would have stuck out.
And he did actually start to write an abridged version himself because he couldn't find a US publisher for it. It was published in the UK. Didn't really make him much money, but it got published. And then because he couldn't secure an American publisher, he started to write an abridged and condensed version of it himself called The Dream of X, but he never completed it before he got killed.
Oh, there's so much potential in it because the nightmarish imagery and the intensity of it are really spectacular.
Yeah, it's very sad because the final volume in the Nightshade Press is The Dream of X and Other Fantastic Visions, but all there is complete of The Dream of X is about 50 pages. Which is a shame. Yeah, it's a great shame. But yeah, one of those authors who left behind, a great deal of interesting material. But what could have been? What could have been? But back to The House on the Borderlands. So the book, after the introduction and the framing device, when the campers have found the manuscript, Tonison and Beregnog, it's got quite a distinct structure in terms of how it's set up in, acts, for want of a better expression. Yeah. Because we've got the opening chapters where we meet who is generally referred to as by the editor and by the people who found the manuscript as the recluse. And almost instantly we go on a trippy astral projection sequence, packed with vivid imagery. Now that terminology isn't used, but essentially he astrally projects into this plane of colossal figures which include Carly, the jade effigy of the house in the centre, beneath a giant black sun, and he has this psychedelic insight into the cosmic nature of the liminal space that the house occupies. And it's really vivid and really striking and really well written. And one of the things that strikes me about it, and one of the things about some of the versions of this I've read in the past, the Sphere edition has an introduction by Gerald Suster. And he refers to his prose as awkward, and he's quite dismissive of the prose style, but states that as the book goes on, it really finds itself and becomes excellent. But I have no problem with the prose style in this at all.
In terms of the sins committed by writers of that era, this doesn't even rank. I mean, if you look at other beloved books, and not the Nightland, but say the Worm Ouroboros, E.R. Edison's one, which is written, another one written in deliberately medieval or Renaissance style prose. I mean, how do you have to apprehend that on its own terms? You can't say, I prefer if he would write it a different way. This is the same sort of thing. You have to go with what the choice is, and maybe that particular writer didn't appreciate it.
Yeah, Yeah, I have no problem with it whatsoever. And on returning to his body 2 days later, where he finds himself being licked and greeted by his dog, Pepper, and I've got to say,
love Pepper.
Dear sweet Pepper.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
I do. That's a nice addition, a nice warm addition. Unfortunately, what happens to Pepper isn't so nice, but
no, but every reference to Pepper is wonderful.
Very cuddly, yes.
You get the sense that this guy had a dog and loved dogs and gets the essence of dogs, because it's brilliant. There's a couple of bits we'll look at. But then you get this second act, which is very much weird fiction stroke horror, where this pit near the house, which is where this ravine is, he's out for a walk with Pepper, and he sees strange swine creatures, like humanoid swine creatures, emerging from the pit, and they appear to communicate with each other, and they're chasing back to the house. There's a really effective chase sequence where there's a description of them occasionally dropping to all fours, and there are numerous horror films over the years that have kind of used this kind of imagery now of like a werewolf running and then dropping to all fours briefly. It's really vivid, it's really cinematic, it's really fast-paced, it's really action-packed. Poor Pepper sustains a wound in his side. Oh, poor Pepper. And it's super effective, but he gets back to the house. We meet the recluse's sister, Mary, who is very much a swooning flake.
Yeah, I mean, that's another minor sin. There was no need for that character to be in the book at all, but there has to be someone for him to protect.
Well, I think there is a reason for Mary to be in the book, but it's not the. I only really started to really hone in on this reading it this time round, because it's the first time I've read it probably in 25 years, I think. And I only started to hone in on this occasion, because you always read books with a kind of different perspective depending on when in your life you read a book, don't you? But we'll probably get to that in a wee while. But there's this absolutely amazing paragraph. Of course, this is all really fucking weird. He's astrally projected to a plane of weird godlike figures on a mountain range with a giant jade effigy of his house in the middle of this plane and a giant black sun with a flaming ring around it up in the sky. And then he's come back to his body, he's gone out for a walk, and he's been chased back home by vicious pigmen. And he's back in the place, and there's this wonderful passage, which I absolutely love. There we go. Reaching my study, I lit the candles. As they burnt up, their rays were reflected from the rack of firearms on the side wall. At the sight, I remembered that I had there a power, which, as I had proved earlier, seemed as fatal to those monsters as to more ordinary animals, and I determined I would take the offensive. First of all, I bound up my hand, for the pain was fast becoming intolerable. After that, it seemed easier, and I crossed the room to the rifle stand. There, I selected a heavy rifle, an old and tried weapon, and, having procured ammunition, I made my way up to one of the small towers with which the house is crowned. From there, I found that I could see nothing. The gardens presented a dim blare of shadows, a little blacker perhaps, where the trees stood. That was all, and I knew that it was useless to shoot down into all that darkness. The only thing to be done was to wait for the moon to rise, then I might be able to do a little execution. In the meantime, I sat still and kept my ears open. The gardens were comparatively quiet now, and only occasional grunt or squeal came up to me. I did not like this silence. It made me wonder on what devilry the creatures were bent. Twice I left the tower and took a walk through the house, but everything was silent. Once I heard a noise from the direction of the pit as though more earth had fallen. Following this and lasting for some 15 minutes, there was a commotion among the denizens of the gardens. This died away, and after that all was quiet again. About an hour later, the moon's light showed above the distant horizon. From where I sat, I could see it over the trees, but it was not until it rose clear of them that I could make out any of the details in the gardens below. Even then, I could see none of the brutes, until, happening to crane forward, I saw several of them lying prone up against the wall of the house. What they were doing, I could not make out. It was, however, a chance too good to be ignored, and, taking aim, I fired at the one directly beneath. There was a shrill scream, and as the smoke cleared away, I saw that it had turned on its back and was writhing feebly. Then it was quiet. The others had disappeared. Immediately after this, I heard a loud squeal in the direction of the pit. It was answered 100 times from every part of the garden. This gave me some notion of the number of creatures, and I began to feel that the whole affair was becoming even more serious than I had imagined. As I sat there, silent and watchful, the thought came to me, why was all this? What were these things? What did it mean? Then my thoughts flew back to that vision, though even now I doubt whether it was a vision of the plane of silence. What did that mean, I wondered, and that thing in the arena? Ugh! Ugly! Lastly, I thought of the house I had seen in that faraway place. That house so like this in every detail of external structure that it might have been modelled from it, or this from that. I had never thought of that. And at that point, it's like, I really feel you, Recluse, because the amount of times I just think, why was all this?
It's amazing it took him that long to ask that question.
Yeah.
Maybe the first pig man, maybe you might want to think that.
Yeah, there are many times over the years where I've thrown my hair up into the air and I wail internally, why was all this? Yeah, so I really feel you, Recluse.
I ask that question every morning when I wake up.
Yeah.
Why is all this?
Why is all this?
Why must I live?
It's wonderful. But there's also a couple of really nice references to the pig speech, and I think in one of them he refers to it as glutinous.
Yeah,
which is a great description. A great description. So we have this big siege by the swine things that, again, very effective. He's boarding up the house. They're trying to break through the windows. He shoots one that's trying to climb through a window. All of the doors are really heavily shod iron doors, so they're all very, very sturdy.
Don't forget the cellar.
Oh, of course.
He has to make sure they can't come up the drain.
Yeah, the cellar. And there's a strange trapdoor in the cellar as well. I really like the cellar bit because we get this reprieve for a while, because from chapter 8 we get this reprieve from what's been a pretty headlong pelt from the introductory chapters describing discovery of the manuscript, astral projection of the recluse into the world of gigantic plane of monstrous figures under the black sun, the chase, the siege of the house by the swine creatures, during which the recluse has barricaded the house, killed some. In one observation, observes their apparent cannibalism, because the one that's struck by the stone, he sees one of them bend over and put something in its mouth. And, of course, they've wounded poor Sweet Pepper, the dog. So we get this quite welcome reprieve from the action. And there's a break from the siege. He takes stock of his surroundings, checks in on his sister Mary and brave Pepper, who's taken to his bed to recuperate. And he has this, although he still has the pluck to wag his tail and lick the fingers of his master when he goes to check on him. Yeah. But Mary, meanwhile, is being rather hysterical and weird, and she seems to be afeard of the recluse, particularly after he finds her.
You see what I mean?
Well, he finds her attempting to open one of the doors he's been so diligently guarding, and he reassures us as best he can, and for fear of her again potentially compromising his house defences, he takes to locking her in her quarters, along with Pepper.
The proper role of a woman is to be protected.
Yeah. Yeah.
For her own good.
Yeah, and again, I can't quite put my finger on why I find his prose so engaging. Is it because it's so direct? It doesn't feel, when you've read something like The Nightland, which is so arcane and so, what's the word? It's there's so much artifice going on.
Florid.
Yeah.
That's a good word for it.
Yeah, there's so much effort going into that prose, whereas this feels really natural and almost effortless. Yeah. This feels like a really great stream of consciousness.
Which
almost.
I would say also about the nautical stories. They're more like this. And his natural writing style, to me, is very readable.
Yeah.
Very consistent.
Yeah. Continues in chapter 9. Of course, this is the one with the strange trapdoor in the cellar. We have this wonderful description of the cellar and, like, Lovecraft, like symbols and carvings in the cellar, Lovecraft would probably describe them as cryptical arabesques or something. Yes. But we get much more direct language with Hodgson. And it's a familiar type of passage if you're a Lovecraft reader, but I don't think Lovecraft ever got as good as this in terms of it being so clean and efficient and evocative without resorting to, like, overwrought language. And we took a look at the Strange High House in the Mist as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and I think that was a good evidence.
There's echoes of this novel the more we talk about it, the more I think about Lovecraft stories that contain various elements of House of the Borderland. I can think of three of them right off the top of my head. The Whisperer in Darkness.
Yep.
The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. We're talking about holes in the cellar.
Yep.
And the Strange High House in the Mist. All three of those very directly.
Yeah, absolutely. And after his disturbing cellar discovery, the recluse is relieved to find that Mary is an improved frame of mind, and Pepper's on the mend too. And this is where I think the character of Mary and her behaviour actually becomes of some relevance to the overall plot and story, because it adds a certain dimension to it. This is Crossing the floor, I approached Pepper. He had waked as I entered, but beyond a slight yelp of pleasure and a soft rapping with his tail, had kept quiet. Oh, I love Pepper. Now, as I patted him, he made an attempt to stand up and succeeded, only to fall back on his side with a little yowl of pain. I spoke to him and bade him lie still. I was greatly delighted with his improvement and also with the natural kindness of my sister's heart in taking such good care of him, in spite of her condition of mind.
Hysterical. She had the vapors.
Yeah.
That's what was going on.
After a while, I left him and went downstairs to my study. In a little time, Mary appeared carrying a tray on which smoked a hot breakfast. As she entered the room, I saw her gaze fasten on the props that supported the study door. Her lips tightened, and I thought she paled slightly, but that was all. Putting the tray down at my elbow, she was leaving the room quietly when I called her back. She came, it seemed, a little timidly, as though startled, and I noted that her hand clutched at her apron nervously. "Come, Mary," I said, "cheer up. Things look brighter. I've seen none of the creatures since yesterday morning, early." She looked at me in a curiously puzzled manner, as though not comprehending. Then intelligence swept into her eyes, and fear, but she said nothing beyond an unintelligible murmur of acquiescence. After that I kept silence. It was evident that reference to the swine things was more than her shaken nerves could bear. Breakfast over, I went up to the tower. Here, during the greater part of the day, I maintained a strict watch over the gardens. Once or twice I went down to the basement to see how my sister was getting along. Each time I found her quiet and curiously submissive. Indeed, on the last occasion she even ventured to address me, on her own account, with regard to some household matter that needed attention. Though this was done with an almost extraordinary timidity, I hailed it with happiness as being the first word voluntarily spoken since the critical moment, when I had caught her unbarring the back door to go out amongst those waiting brutes. I wondered whether she was aware of her attempt and how near a thing it had been, but I refrained from questioning her, thinking it best to let well alone. That night I slept in a bed for the first time for 2 nights. In the morning I rose early and took a walk through the house. All was as it should be, and I went up to the tower to have a look at the gardens. Here again I found perfect quietness. At breakfast, when I met Mary, I was greatly pleased to see that she had sufficiently regained command over herself to be able to greet me in a perfectly natural manner. She talked sensibly and quietly, only keeping carefully from any mention of the past couple of days. In this I humoured her to the extent of not attempting to lead the conversation in that direction. Earlier in the morning I'd been to see Pepper. He was mending rapidly and bade fair to be on his legs, in earnest, in another day or two. Before leaving the breakfast table I made some reference to this improvement. In the short discussion that followed I was surprised to gather, from my sister's remarks, that she was still under the impression that this wound had been given by the wildcat of my invention. It made me feel almost ashamed of myself for deceiving her, yet the lie had been told to prevent her from being frightened, and then I had been sure that she must have known the truth later when those brutes had attacked the house. During the day I kept on the alert, spending much of my time, as on the previous day, in the tower, but not a sign could I see of the swine creatures nor hear any sound. Several times the thought had come to me that the things had at last left us, but up to this time I had refused to entertain the idea seriously. Now, however, I began to feel that there was reason for hope. It would soon be 3 days since I had seen any of the things, but still I intended to use the utmost caution. For all that I could tell, this protracted silence might be a ruse to tempt me from the house, perhaps right into their arms. The thought of such a contingency was, alone, sufficient to make me circumspect. So it was that the 4th, 5th, and 6th days went by quietly, without my making any attempt to leave the house. On the 6th day I had the pleasure of seeing Pepper once more upon his feet, and though still very weak, he managed to keep me company during the whole of that day. So, what is the deal with Mary?
Nothing you just said changed my opinion. You know, she's an expression of how he expects a female to react. In circumstances, she collapses psychologically.
Or she thinks she's stuck in the house with a brother who's violent and detached from his senses.
Well, that's a good modern interpretation. So
Because
he's the one she fears.
Yeah, that's what this suggests to me on this reading. The recluse has zero personal insight into what may very well be delusions, and there's lots of evidence coming up over subsequent pages, because he finds no evidence of the pig creatures in the gardens. If she thinks that there are pig creatures about, why would she be going to open the door, unless she thinks that she's asleep and she can actually get out of the house for some air, which
so
is why
suggesting this entire story is a fevered, mad vision of the recluse.
It's a reading. And we'll get to a point later on where editorial footnotes start to suggest that you do not take the narrator or the recluse seriously. And it's I've never read it this way before. When I read this as a kid,
this did not occur to me.
Yeah.
I have to say.
When I read this as a kid and then reading it again as a pothead, I processed it purely as cosmic horror with dated and archaic presuppositions about the mental capacity of a frail and delicate lady to deal with the unnatural and weird, right? But it's possible to read this in an entirely different way, and it works in different levels. And I'm sure this might be glaringly obvious to some people who'd read this for the first time in 2024. I don't know. But this is one of the curious things about repeated rereading, sometimes decades apart, and as a reader with different frames of reference depending on where you are at the time. And this is one of the wonderful things about reading and the written word. This is why reading fucking rules. This is why books rule. This is why they're so great, because you can apply different readings to them. But on this occasion, I'm finding more and more suggestions as I read this, seeded by Hope Hodgson, to suggest that actually the reason Mary is terrified and almost out of her mind is because her brother has completely lost it, is boarding up the house, is running around with a rifle, is shooting at things, is behaving really irrationally. And the bit at the beginning of that chapter where he senses that someone has passed his door but can't quite understand why she would sneak past his door to try and open the exterior door would fit with the fact that she thinks he's asleep and actually she can potentially get some fresh air.
I think maybe my perceptions, the reason this hasn't occurred to me is I read The Nightland and this book too close together. And so, the unsubtle portrayal of, a male-female relationship of any kind in that novel may have colored my perception. I first read this novel many years ago, and then I reread it recently. So I've only read it twice.
Yeah.
And this time around, it's plausible what you present. I don't know if, I'd be surprised if Hodgson had the subtlety to do this, but it does make sense now that you're explaining it that way.
It's one of those weird things, isn't it?
It is a possible interpretation. Because his behavior
I've never ever translated it this way.
His behavior is that of a man who is having some kind of psychotic break, if you think about it. Because there are no pigmen. There are no pigmen.
No.
You've blown my mind.
It's the first time this has ever occurred to me on reading this book. But now I've thought of it, there are points in the book. You can view it one of two ways. One is it's got a terribly unsubtle way of articulating how a woman responds to pressure. Or two, is seeded an incredibly subtle mystery and ambiguity into this book.
Another reason, of course, why I would read it the way I did and the way most people do is that the attitudes were not, if it is that the woman is, emotionally unable to rise to the occasion, that is how women were viewed, But, perhaps Hodgson had more subtlety of mind than we think.
I don't know. But yeah, it's fun. But again, that's a great thing about reading, isn't it? And interpretation and everything else.
Highest of the art forms, the written word.
Yeah. But after 9 days unmolested by swine creatures, anyway, and with Pepper recovered, the recluse is determined to investigate the gardens and finds little to no evidence of their presence. So he ventures into the ravine where the underground stream exists and enters the earth, which he refers to as the subterranean pit. And to cut a long story short, because this goes on for several chapters, thanks to a deluge, he and Pepper almost drown and are nearly swept into a deep chasm.
But who saves the day? Who saves the day there? Yeah.
Pepper. Good old Pepper.
Faithful and wise Pepper.
Yeah. They escape, get back to the house, where he spends a couple of weeks, probably with pneumonia. Doesn't say pneumonia, but he spends a couple of weeks with pneumonia, being nursed back to health by Mary, but is still obsessed with that idea that beneath the house is a deep pit, an abyss, the domed roof of which he believes supports the foundations of the house, so is determined to head back into the cellar and check out that mysterious trapdoor. Reaching the place, I walked slowly up the centre until I came to the trap. There it was, with the stones piled upon it just as I had last seen it. I had a lantern with me, and the idea came to me that now would be a good time to investigate whatever lay under the grey oak slab. Placing the lantern on the floor, I tumbled the stones off the trap. This is because I haven't put my glasses on. This is so tedious. My eyes have got so bad. Let me get my glasses on. As I did so, the cellar became filled with the sound of a murmurous thunder that rose from far below. At the same time, a damp wind blew up into my face, bringing with it a cloud of fine spray. Therewith, I dropped the trap hurriedly with a half-frightened feeling of wonder. For a moment, I stood puzzled. I was not particularly afraid. The haunting fear of the swine things had left me long ago, but I was certainly nervous and astonished. Then a sudden thought possessed me, and I raised the ponderous door with a feeling of excitement. Leaving it standing upon its end, I seized the lantern and, kneeling down, thrust it into the opening. As I did so, the moist wind and spray drove in my eyes, making me unable to see for a few moments. Even when my eyes were clear, I could distinguish nothing below me save darkness and whirling spray. Seeing that it was useless to expect to make out anything with the light so high, I felt in my pockets for a piece of twine with which to lower it further into the opening. Even as I fumbled, the lantern slipped from my fingers and hurtled down into the darkness. For a brief instant I watched its fall and saw the light shine on a tumult of white foam some 80 or 100 feet below me. Then it was gone. My sudden surmise was correct, and now I knew the cause of the wet and noise. The great cellar was connected with the pit by means of the trap, which opened right above it, and the moisture was the spray rising from the water falling into the depths. In an instant I had an explanation of certain things that hitherto had puzzled me. Now I could understand why the noises, on the first night of the invasion, had seemed to rise directly from under my feet, and the chuckle that had sounded when first I opened the trap. Evidently, some of the swine things must have been right beneath me. Another thought struck me. Were the creatures all drowned? Would they drown? I remembered how unable I had been to find any trace to show that the shooting had been really fatal. Had they life, as we understand life, or were they ghouls? These thoughts flashed through my brain, and as I stood in the dark searching my pockets for matches, I had the box in my hand now, and, striking a light, I stepped to the trapdoor and closed it. Then I piled the stones back upon it, after which I made my way out from the cellars. And so, I suppose the water goes on, thundering down into that bottomless hell pit. Sometimes I have an inexplicable desire to go down to the great cellar, open the trap, and gaze into the impenetrable, spray-damp darkness. At times the desire becomes almost overpowering in its intensity. It is not mere curiosity that prompts me, but more as though some unexplained influence were at work. Still, I never go and intend to fight down the strange longing and crush it, even as I would the unholy thought of self-destruction. This idea of some intangible force being exerted may seem reasonless, yet my instinct warns me that it is not so. In these things, reason seems to me less to be trusted than instinct. One thing there is, in closing, that impresses itself upon me with ever-growing insistence. It is that I live in a very strange house, a very awful house, and I have begun to wonder whether I am doing wisely in staying here. Yet if I left, where could I go and still obtain the solitude and the sense of her presence? That alone makes my old life unbearable. And for the first time we get an asterisk and a footnote from the editor, and it says, when he says her presence, the footnote says, an apparently unmeaning interpolation. I can find no previous reference in the manuscripts to this matter. It becomes clearer, however, in the light of succeeding incidents.
Oh, it certainly does. All of a sudden, the tone, as well as the setting, is going to change drastically.
So, we're halfway through this book. All right. Allister, consider this, if you can, from your mindset of first reading it. Where were you with it? And what were you thinking about where this book might go from here?
Obviously, I felt that it was going to continue on in some similar vein. And this is what's, this is where we get into the strangeness of the unfettered imagination in an era where things like editors, there were editors, obviously, and publishing companies edited books to some degree. But there wasn't this codified system where, I would, like I do today, would evaluate a novel and say, your novel changes drastically to an entirely different book halfway through. We must fix this, right? This is what I would do now. There was no one to tell Hope Hodgson, don't do that. If you want to have that as a book, that's a separate story. Don't, people aren't going to like the fact that you have written two books in one and you've so tenuously joined them together. But he got away with it because of the time. You have a choice of whether to go with what follows, which you'll explain to us, or not. But yeah, at first it's very jarring. You think, this isn't a very good book. This shouldn't happen, because we're used to thinking that way now. Yeah. That, everything should be constructed. A story needs to be constructed a certain way, and there are rules, right? Yeah. You got to have your arc in the plot, and you've got to have your 3 acts. And what happens in the first act is we find out what the characters in the situation are. In the second act, the themes are deepened. And in the third act, we come to a crisis and a catharsis. Yeah. And so that's how 99% of fiction is now written. Now, back then, they didn't care a damn about those rules. And this is an example of that.
Yeah, because this book goes fucking nuts.
Absolutely mental. Yes.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. So the editor of the manuscript, who of course we assume to be Hodgson in his role as the recipient of the manuscript and the guy making this remarkable story available to us, points out that there's a section of the document where it becomes unintelligible due to damaged pages, but the few scraps he can transcribe and share with us are offered.
Are very detailed.
Yeah. There are multiple references to she as the recluse makes observations about the cosmos and the planets and how she would speak to him through the Sea of Dreams. And she's this, like, I don't know, is she a lost love? Is she...
Clearly, it could be a similar situation to what's described in the Nightland, where there's somebody in the history of his past lives that was his perfect love. This is where his courtly romance thing starts to kick in that Hodgson clearly had an obsession with.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that I liken this whole sequence most closely to in fiction is 2001.
Oh, yeah.
Where, all of a sudden our character, after, the Hal revolts, is sent off in this capsule and goes through an inexplicable psychedelic experience that I guess I never read the novelization, so I don't know what Clark's justification for this was. But, we assume this is something to do with the aliens who advanced human consciousness. But anyway, he's sent on this psychedelic journey. This is exactly what's happening to the character in this novel.
Yeah, the recluse has gone through the Stargate.
Loosely related to the Jade House in the Valley and the giant god-like figures and the pigmen. Very loosely related.
Yeah. So he's gone through the Stargate.
Yeah. Some attempt to join it up, but then he just goes apeshit.
Yeah. He's gone through the Stargate while sitting in his study with Pepper at his feet. And funnily enough, the Arthur C. Clarke 2001 novel, which he wrote at the same time as the film was being made, there are a couple of differences. One is that it's Saturn, not Jupiter, number one. But they decided to make it Jupiter in the film because they didn't know how to do Saturn's rings, I don't think. Right. They thought that would have been more difficult to accomplish, so they decided to go for Jupiter instead. But the other difference is when he goes through the Stargate, it's a much more mechanical deal. He sees, like, vast arrays of machinery.
Okay, so it's more obvious who's doing this then.
Yeah,
right.
And, like, sort of alien megastructures. And it's a long time since I've read it. Probably 30 years since I've read 2000.
I have it here and I've never read it. I should.
Yeah. I like it. I mean, I think Arthur C. Clarke's a really dry writer. I finally got round to reading Rendezvous with Rama a while ago. And I think I've built it up in my head to be something that it wasn't. It's great conceptually, but it's not that great.
Well, it's way better than the sequels. The sequels are far worse. But
oh yeah, I didn't read the sequels because I heard they go rapidly downhill and have some strange sexual politics in them. I think I seem to remember reading as well.
It's a classic example of something people ignore too often in science fiction, which is the first one worked. There isn't necessarily enough in this concept to do more, but there's always this, and now we're going to make a series. Sometimes that's not the best idea. But anyway.
I'm surprised nobody's made a streaming series of Rendezvous with Rama yet. It seems like probably prime.
Careful what you
matter. Wish
for. Yeah, Amazon will start doing that and it'll be awful.
I never got through the Foundation series. I don't think I finished season 1. So yeah, probably won't be funny.
Wheel of Time. Oh, they're all terrible.
Yeah, I think I watched the first 2 episodes of The Wheel of Time. I've never read any of the books. My friend Gemma, her mate, was recommending The Wheel of Time to me once when we were sitting in Saltaire Park. Saltaire Dragon Boat Festival of all things. And she was trying to sell them to me, so I thought, all right, so I got the first one. I got my 6 chapters in. I was like, fuck this. There's like 10 million pages of this. No, thank you.
Yeah. Well, not everything is for everybody, but anyway, 2001. Bit like that.
So the recluse is there sitting in his study with Peppers at his feet, and he begins to observe and consider the passage of time. And it's a curiously melancholic and quite beautifully serene series of passages.
One of the best parts. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's really good. I mean, I think it might lay it on a wee bit thick at first in terms of articulating how the time progression is occurring. There's so many numerous references to clouds and moons.
It gets repetitive, yeah.
It does get repetitive, but it doesn't last too long before it really starts to kick in. And again, I'm reading this as a guy in his 50s, but even reading this as a teen, I remember being really emotionally quite caught up in it. That sense that at some point in one's own story, you become acutely aware that the days and the seasons and life itself are just tearing by at a bewildering pace.
And you will be gone. And you're just a little blip. It's similar to Time Machine, the sequence at the end, where
Yes.
the traveler goes ahead in time.
Yeah, it is. And when I was reading it, I was thinking a lot of this. There are scenes in the George Pal time machine where time is slipping by. He's just sitting there and he's watching the walls collapse in his house, and he's watching the moon fly by and all this. But there's some absolutely wonderful, wonderful language in here as everything's tearing by. It was a little later that I noticed that the sun had begun to have the suspicion of a trail of fire behind it. This was due, evidently, to the speed at which, apparently, traversed the heavens. And as the days sped, each one quicker than the last, the sun began to assume the appearance of a vast, flaming comet. And we get one of our editor's footnotes here. It says, the recluse uses this as an illustration, evidently in the sense of the popular conception of a comet. That's the first of many snarky comments that Hodson makes on the text of the manuscript, and they get snarkier as it goes. At night, the moon presented, with much greater truth, a comet-like aspect, a pale and singularly clear, fast-travelling shape of fire, trailing streaks of cold flame. The stars showed now merely as fine hairs of fire against the dark. Once I turned from the window and glanced at Pepper. In the flash of a day I saw that he slept quietly, and I moved once more to my watching. The sun was now bursting up from the eastern horizon, like a stupendous rocket, seeming to occupy no more than a second or two in hurling from east to west. I could no longer perceive the passage of clouds across the sky, which seemed to have darkened somewhat. The brief nights appeared to have lost the proper darkness of night, so that the hair-like fire of the flying stars showed but dimly. As the speed increased, the sun began to sway very slowly in the sky from north to south, and then slowly again from north to south. So amid a strange confusion of mind, the hours passed. We'll come back to that north to south and south to north thing again later on as well. All this while had Pepper slept. Presently, feeling lonely and distraught, I called to him softly, but he took no notice. Again I called, raising my voice slightly. Still he moved not. I walked over to where he lay and touched him with my foot to rouse him. At the action, gentle though it was, he fell to pieces. That is what happened. He literally and actually crumbled into a mouldering heap of bones and dust. Oh, Pepper.
A sudden and anticlimactic demise for Pepper.
But it's strangely wonderful. The dog just laying there at his feet until it dies and crumbles away.
Quite the imagery, yes.
For the space of perhaps a minute I stared down at the shapeless heap that had once been Pepper. I stood feeling stunned. What can have happened? I asked myself, not at once grasping the grim significance of that little hill of ash. Then, as I stirred the heap with my foot, it occurred to me that this could only happen in a great space of time. Years and years. Outside, the wearying, fluttering light held the world. Inside I stood, trying to understand what it meant, what that little pile of dust and dry bones on the carpet meant, but I could not think coherently. I glanced away around the room, and now for the first time noticed how dusty and old the place looked. Dust and dirt everywhere, piled in little heaps in the corners, and spread about upon the furniture. The very carpet itself was invisible beneath a coating of the same all-pervading material. As I walked, little clouds of the stuff rose up from under my footsteps and assailed my nostrils with a dry, bitter odour that made me wheeze huskily. Suddenly, as my glance fell upon Pepper's remains, I stood still and gave voice to my confusion, questioning, aloud, whether the years were indeed passing, whether this, which I had taken to be a form of vision, was, in truth, a reality. I paused. A new thought had struck me. Quickly, but with steps which, for the first time I noticed, tottered, I went across the room to the great pier glass and looked in. It, too, was covered with grime, to give back any reflection, and with trembling hands I began to rub off the dirt. Presently I could see myself. The thought that had come to me was confirmed. Instead of the great, hale man who scarcely looked 50, I was looking at a bent, decrepit man, whose shoulders stooped, and whose face was wrinkled with the years of a century. The hair, which a few short hours ago had been nearly coal black, was now silvery white. Only the eyes were bright. Gradually I traced in that ancient man a faint resemblance to myself of other days. Oh, fucking hell, mate. Seriously.
Yeah.
He describes himself from the very outset as an old man, and we found out he's 50.
Yeah. Well, life expectancies were shorter back then. Yeah. But pretty soon, after this, he becomes disembodied entirely. So
yeah, he does.
He becomes like Pepper.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, fucking hell, mate. He's going through this. His dog's dead. He's looked in the mirror and realised he's got white-haired and old. I mean, holy shit,
really,
that happens to me every
old.
fucking day, and I'm only just early 50. But there's another tremendous line a page or two on when he says, I can best describe the passage of day and night at this period as a sort of gigantic, ponderous flicker. Oh, I
Yeah,
love it.
he's
I
one
love
of
it
those
and
ones-
hate it.
When he gets it right, he gets it right. He's one of those
Yeah.
writers.
I love it and hate it at the same time. Now, of the subsequent chapters, it does get more fascinating, not just because of what's happening in the narrative, but also because of how Hodgson handles it in both his writing and his ideas. And we've seen a couple of those footnotes, one of which was a little bit snarky, and is intervening more and more as the editor now and inserting footnotes to attempt to explain some of the recluse's observations. As time passes so quickly, the sun grows larger but dimmer in the sky, the earth grows so cold that the recluse observes the air lying frozen on the moulded remains of the landscape around him, which is wonderful. And at one point, and this is particularly cool from the standpoint of this piece of word fiction from 1908, the editor translates one particular observation to mean something very, very specific, although he can't quite put his finger on it. And when I read this, I fucking loved it, because it says, the end came all at once. The night had been the longest yet, and when the dying sun showed, at last, above the world's edge, I had grown so wearied of the dark that I greeted it as a friend. It rose steadily until about 20 degrees above the horizon, then stopped suddenly, and after a strange retrograde movement, hung motionless, a great shield in the sky. And there's an indicator for a footnote there. But only the circular rim of the sun showed bright, only this and one thin streak of light near the equator. Gradually, even this thread of light died out, and now all that was left of our great and glorious sun was a vast dead disk, rimmed with a thin circle of bronze-red light. And the editor's footnote reads, I am confounded that neither here nor later on does the recluse make any further mention of the continued north and south movement, apparent, of course, of the sun from solstice to solstice. And,
Quibbling. Minor quibble.
but actually what he's saying is the earth has aged so much that precession has ceased.
Well, I mean, in light of what follows, the zaniness that follows this, that's a minor quibble, because now we're about to have things happen that there's no explanation for.
But it's not a quibble. It's not a quibble for me. It's the editor.
You feel this is the science. The science is correct.
Yeah, I think the editor is saying, the narrator is making an observation that the earth has got so old, the earth's wobble on its axis has just stopped.
Not spinning.
But Hope Hodgson is saying he's puzzled at this point, as the editor, that there are no further references to the precession of the solstices. It's such a weird thing. It's like Hodgson, the editor, saying, why are there no more precessions of the solstices and the equinox and the solstice? And it's strange to me that the manuscript no longer makes any reference to it, but what he's actually describing in the editor's footnote is the earth aging to the point where precession has simply ceased because the earth has run out of energy.
It's being overly pedantic with himself.
I just think it's absolutely fascinating. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And I think Hodgson was obviously a smart dude. He wasn't just writing trippy shit. He was thinking about all this, and he was seeding his writing with all sorts of ideas. And it's wonderful. And the editorial interventions increase as the recluse's observations about the emergence of a great green star preceding the ultimate death of the solar system. It's fucking bonkers. And it's even more bonkers when the footnotes are now actively questioning the veracity of the recluse's narrative. Because over on page 138, there is another passage where it says, from the abutment where once had been the windows, through which I had watched that first fatal dawn, I could see that the sun was hugely greater than it had been when first the star lit the world. So great was it that its lower edge seemed almost to touch the far horizon. Even as I watched, I imagined that it drew closer. The radiance of green that lit the frozen earth grew steadily brighter. Thus, for a long space, things were. Then, on a sudden, I saw that the sun was changing shape and growing smaller, just as the sun would have done in past time. In a while, only a third of the illuminated part was turned towards the earth. The star bore away on the left. Gradually, as the world moved on, the star shone up on the front of the house once more, while the sun showed only as a great green bow of green fire. An instant it seemed that the sun had vanished. The star was still fully visible. Then the earth moved into the black shadow of the sun, and all was night. Night, black, starless, and intolerable. Filled with tumultuous thoughts, I watched across the night, waiting. Years it may have been, and then, in the dark house behind me, the clothed stillness of the world was broken. I seemed to hear a soft padding of many feet, and a faint inarticulate whisper of sound grew on my senses. I looked around into the blackness and saw a multitude of eyes. As I stared, they increased and appeared to come towards me. For an instant I stood, unable to move. That hideous swine noise rose up into the night. Footnote. So a footnote there, when the hideous swine noise rises up into the night. And the footnote says, see footnote page 129. Oh, what did he say on 100 page? Oh, let's go and have a look. So on page 129, his footnote is as follows. So the paragraph says, the world was held in a savage gloom, cold and intolerable. Outside all was quiet. Quiet. From the dark room behind me came the occasional soft thud of falling matter. And the footnote says, at this time, the sound-carrying atmosphere must have been either incredibly attenuated or, more probably, non-existent. In the light of this, it cannot be supposed that these or any other noises would have been apparent to living ears, to hearing as we, in the material body, understand that sense. So, the editor's footnote is now saying, you know what, this doesn't make any sense, because if the
atmosphere for sound to carry in, I guess.
If the atmosphere is laying frozen on the ground, he can't possibly be hearing these things.
Yeah, well, he's a disembodied spirit. Who knows what he can hear?
Yeah, but it's so funny that the editor's footnotes are the editor snarkily saying, yeah, that's bullshit. I call bullshit on him hearing pig swine noises. It's mad. It's fucking mad. On any number of read-throughs, these footnotes could be easily missed or disregarded as a pretentious literary device, which, to be fair, they probably are. But if you actively consider and absorb them, the editor is now actively working against the recluse's tale and prompting the reader to disbelieve him.
Right.
Adding weight to the various hints along the way that this manuscript is the account of a man suffering severe delusions, or his astral projections are wild dreams, or it's another way of reading it, or certainly is recounting this while possessed of some moments of lucidity.
Right.
Or these might have been fleeting because we've got the damage to one section which could have been deliberate, where he's talking about she, which has been perhaps deliberately damaged or accidentally damaged. There are so many weird things in this book that are surprising. Like, why have that section where the manuscript is damaged? It seems really random and weird, unless you think the recluse has actively gone back and torn out pages or damaged that part of the manuscript.
Well, that's how I read it. It can't just be that he didn't want to explain, because he's happy to explain everything else. So
yeah,
you know,
it's just wonderful. And the book hasn't got as trippy as it gets yet either.
No, it gets real trippy.
Yeah, so as the green sun expands, absorbs the dead sun, leads the recluse to muse upon whether all dead suns get absorbed by the green star, and that's the true centre of the universe. Then it spits out some celestial globes of gold, because fuck it, why not?
Which he enters one of these things and has a vision of his lost love that sends him back, and you know.
And that is, again, really sad and melancholic, because it's described throughout the time. He's describing, like, watching the age-death of the solar system and potentially the universe. He refers to the crushing loneliness of it all. And he now attributes grief to the sensation of getting back to the Sea of Dreams to meet her again, the great astral love of his life.
You know, loss is one of the greatest themes that we go back to over and over again. Yeah. Loss, because what do we experience throughout our lives? But a series of losses, and the older you get, the more loss you experience. So, I mean, that's, you know, if you set aside the fanciful nature of this and some of his views on love and all that, there's still this human core to this about things that we all experience. And the other thing that, you know, reason I'm attracted to this sort of story, the idea of us being so small in the cosmos is very common now. Not so common for that time in mainstream thought, because, you know, it was a very Christian society. But the idea, and again, similar to Lovecraft, that the individual human life is so small that not only can we not understand our lives, we can't understand anything. No matter what amount of knowledge or quality of knowledge we acquire through science, it's still going to be a tiny fraction of what the actual reality of the universe is. Now, to Lovecraft, that was frightening, clearly. But Hodgson is using a similar sort of device. I realize now that I am nothing, and all these things are happening around me, and they're beyond my comprehension. And I find that very interesting and appealing as well, because, I mean, it's true. You know, what we understand of the universe is what we can apprehend through our senses, and then interpret that data through the limitations of our human minds, which are, you know, a cat's mind is limited. Pepper's mind is limited to whatever Pepper can understand as a dog. And we're limited to what we can understand as a human, and we always will be. And that runs counter to this idea of human as God that pervades our civilization. It's one of the reasons why we're going to make ourselves extinct, let's face it. This idea that we're gods and we can expand endlessly into the universe and transcend being an animal. Well, what Hodgson and Lovecraft are saying is, no way. We are literally nothing in the face of these cosmic forces. And that adds to the melancholy, right? That realization that your life really isn't all that important. But the lives of the people and the pets that you've known, they're everything to you, right? And that loss means everything, that everything must die. So to me, that's what underlies the whole meaning of this sort of book for me, and the reason it succeeds. That's my little monologue about it.
No, I think you're absolutely correct. I think everything that's at the heart of this is trauma. And this guy, this recluse, this idea that he's got back together with the great astral love of his life just to lose her again and suffer great grief at her, the point where she says, I have to go. It's time for me to go.
Is permanent, no matter even in those circumstances.
Yeah. And, ultimately, one of the things that are at the heart of most mental illness is trauma as well. And the more I read of this, the more I read it as a meditation on trauma-induced delusion. I think it's a fascinating book, but it comes out of his astral projection. He's back in his study. This is actually, he goes full circle back to the Great Plain with a jade effigy of the house at the centre and the giant ancient gods around the fringes staring inwards. And then he's back in his chair. So he's gone through this huge vision of the death of the solar system, potentially the death of the universe, and he's back in his chair, he's back in his study awake, and all is as it was, except Pepper is still only ash. Oh, dear sweet Pepper. And the manuscript kind of rattles to a close now, and post this, the recluse is even more obsessed and actually becomes increasingly cruel and paranoid at this point, because he gets another dog, and Mary has a cat. And he won't have the dog in the house because he can't replace Pepper, so he keeps the dog in a kennel outside, chained up, even though in his head he's still obsessed with the idea that swine beasts are abroad. And the dog gets some kind of wound, and the dog is behaving in a traumatised fashion as well. And to cut a long story short, the dog licks his hand and he starts to get paranoid that the dog has transferred some kind of
cosmic disease
to him. So he shoots the dog in front of Mary. The cat's vanished and he's probably dead. And then classic Lovecraft device to end a story. The story ends with something's about to break in to get the author, and the writing trails off.
An eldritch thing is coming.
Yeah. It's coming through the door. Arg. Pen trails off.
I mean, if there was a flaw to this book, it depends on your interpretation, of course. If this is all part of his mental illness, then it makes sense. But that whole coda makes no sense after the cosmic vision. He could have just tapered the story off any old way. But having this, like, are we infected with a cosmic flesh-eating disease or something like that? It was just one step too many in a novel that it was leap after leap. Then all of a sudden you're going to finish with that. If you are going to interpret as he is suffering from a series of delusions and that's just the latest one, then I guess I can see it.
That's the only way I can really interpret it now. His behaviour post the vision.
And then, of course, after that, we have to wrap up with our two travelers.
Yeah. The first question one of them asks is, was he mad? And that's a question that they're directly asking of the reader.
What do you make of the behavior of the villagers towards these two travelers? They're just suspicious of strangers because, in a small Irish village, they don't like Englishmen. Or do you read something more into that?
This could have been set in Dorset, and I think it would have been the same. If you had a couple of guys in Dorset or a remote version
asking
of Dartmoor,
weird questions.
Asking weird questions of the hill, the house up on the ruined house up on the hill, which the locals just go, "Oh, the fairies own that." The fairies own that real estate. Yeah, but find out that actually there has been some observations of the oldest person in the village, that some guy once came through with a cart and a woman pulled by donkeys, and they would see him once every couple of months, but eventually the house collapsed and the villagers went and had a look, and that was the end of it. And that was decades ago. Yeah. I think it's fascinating that the book ends with the finders of the manuscripts musing over the author of the account's sanity and trying somehow to investigate it, but what they do get is old knowledge and inconclusive beyond saying, yeah, someone lived there, but the house fell down, and now it's a place of fairies.
Well, this is why it's a great book. A great book will leave you with answers, but it'll also leave you with questions that you have to figure out for yourself, right? That's great literature.
I knew that rereading this and talking about it again, I would enjoy it because I love it, and I think this is the third or fourth time I've read it, and I think it's great. But as is often the case, I've just discovered more. It's like peeling an onion. There are more and more and more layers to this. And even though, things like schizophrenia hadn't been given tags or names or definitions or anything like that in 1908, people were still suffering from these kind of things. And Hope Hodgson, I'm sure, will have come into contact with people suffering from all sorts of mental illnesses. And I don't know. Who knows? Who knows what informs something like this? Yeah, I mean, his dad was a clergyman, wasn't he? So up until the age of 14, he probably came across all sorts of people and all sorts of problems.
That alone is enough to give people trauma. Having a stern clergyman for a father.
Yes. It's absolutely fascinating. Before we go on to the strange high house in the mist, the companion piece that we decided to read, final thoughts on the house on the Borderland?
Well, I mean, I think this conversation has actually reaffirmed my affection for it because when I first read it, I liked it a lot, and I knew it was a cut above a lot of the weird fiction from that period. I knew there was something more to it. And I reread it recently, and I enjoyed it even more. But, this conversation has really emphasized the layers that are in it. Because at first reading, if you're reading it very lightly, those things that we were laughing about earlier really stick out. The fact that it's disjointed. At first glance, it's very disjointed. It's a number of different narratives stuck together and with loose references to different parts so that you think that they're part of the same story. But at a closer reading, the relationship between the themes is firmed up. So, I mean, I think the next time I read it, I will have that in mind. But I mean, for anybody interested in, mystical, metaphysical, visionary kinds of writing, a lot of people won't have come across this book unless they're fans of horror and fantasy fiction. But I mean, the literary value, I mean, maybe I'm very forgiving. I don't know. I work with lots of writers, and I think I've told you before, by the time you finish working with a writer, you can make almost anybody's prose good. This is not a big mystery. Talent is something of a myth. Some people are more talented than others, but if you decide to be a writer, the chances are you apply yourself and work with an editor, you're going to be pretty good. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the way he writes. There's something wrong with the way he writes in the Nightland, but that was a choice he made. But it is actually a very readable and albeit individualistic style of writing. And you have to have that to write visionary work. You can't be, writing by numbers. You can't be writing with Hemingway-esque efficiency. Like that, that works for a certain kind of book. For this kind of book, you need to be a little crazy. Right? I know that's kind of an archaic way of putting it, but you have to be, you have to have that little edge, beat to your creativity. And clearly Hope Hodgson had that. I mean, this is something that everybody with an interest in that kind of fiction should read. Along with A Voyage to Arcturus, which is the other.
Well, I'm going to be making a run at that as soon as I can dig it out from the piles of books.
I guarantee you will enjoy that.
Yeah. Well, I'll dig that out, and hopefully we'll get back together in the new year and we'll talk about that. So we decided. Now you're a Lovecraft reader, and you know your Lovecraft. So we decided, and I think it was kind of we made the decision quite quickly. If we were going to read a companion piece to this, would maybe pick a Lovecraft story with similar themes. So we pulled out The Strange High House in the Mist, which is a nice, short, and well-formed 10 pages.
Well-formed?
Okay. Well, okay. Compact let's say compact and bijou.
Right, let's put my cards on the table for this one. There's two kinds of Lovecraft stories. There's the cosmic horror, and there's the dream cycle. I mean, that's a rough explanation. I'm not really a big fan of the dream cycle stuff. I understand that dreams are surreal. I have them all the time, and my dreams are pretty crazy. And so that allowed him to be very, very surreal and not to make much sense other than, indulging his passion for high-flown purple prose. And that's basically what those did. And it's all unified by this character of Randolph Carter. And it's just, it doesn't do it. I enjoy them, but it doesn't do as much for me as the horror writing, or the cosmic horror stuff. And this is a classic example of that. Nothing is explained really. It's just an excuse to talk about spires and gambrel roofs and dreaming alleys of Kingsport and and to talk about the mists and dreams and why is there a figure knocking on the door of this house? Why is this house there? Who's the weird immortal man in the house? We don't need to know that because it's all just part of the dream cycle. Yeah, and it's just so florid. And that's another. I just keep using that word, but I mean that really it's the worst and the best of Lovecraft in one thing, because when like any of these guys, sometimes he hits a line and you're like, wow. And in the same story, he'll have a paragraph where you're just like, will you just effing get to the point?
Yeah.
But that was Lovecraft for you. So, I mean, it shares a concept. Here's this lonely remote building and nobody knows why it's there.
Yeah.
But it doesn't hold a candle to, I know it's much shorter, but it doesn't hold a candle to House on the Borderland for quality.
There's more fluff in these 10 pages than there is in the entire 180 pages of the House on the Borderland.
If you want to look at something that approximates, with the quality we're seeing, that's the one thing. It only occurred to me during this conversation, but The Whisper in Darkness, where the aliens from Yuggoth are trying to get in the guy's house in the towering hills of Vermont, and he's shooting at them, and there's a dog. It's exactly the same thing that's happening in this story. But the quality is there. It's a page turner. You want to know what happens next. You're horrified and titillated in equal measure. Like that's good. That's good Lovecraft. Yeah. But the one about the house on the headland is.
He's in Dunsany mode, isn't he? With stuff like this.
I've tried to read Dunsany in the past and usually failed.
Yeah, so you got references. He's got references to fairy. There's one at one point he says far elfin horns, which is straight out of Dunsany. There's some nice bits and pieces in it, but the prose is like overwrought. I like that he's building a setting and referencing characters from other stories like The Terrible Old Man, because Lovecraft had his own like shared universe already with his own stories.
But that's my problem is the dream cycle where it intersects with the Cthulhu mythos and all that. It doesn't often make much sense. It's like he's just having fun sticking in references to the one thing into the other thing, and it's a bit of a mess.
Yeah, I mean, what's it even about? It's about Loz used to say that he used to summarize Lovecraft stories. Said the thing on the doorstep, you could write it really quickly. There's a thing on the doorstep. It was the thing on the doorstep, and but what Loz missed was. This is called The Strange High House on the Mist, and it's like there's a house in the mist. It's quite a high house, and it's strange, and it's high up in the mist. Then you add 10 pages of florid language that goes nowhere and says nothing. But it's nice in some ways. I like Lovecraft's Kingsport stuff for one reason, really, and I think it's down to being from a fishing port myself, and even as a kid, not just being from a fishing port, holidaying in Yorkshire coastal towns as a kid, like places like Whitby and other places that back in the 70s and 80s still
I've been to Bridlington in my day.
Oh, yeah, Brid. A lot of my mates were from Brid.
My father was Yorkshireman. So.
Yeah. When I was a teenager, a lot of my mates who came to live in Hull were from Brid, because for people from Brid, Hull was like going to Vegas, Hull was the bright lights when you lived in Bridlington. But those places, back in the 70s and 80s, still had that kind of decaying old town feel with... But
that's why The Shadow over Innsmouth is the clear winner there.
Oh, but I like the Kingsport stuff because I still, they have that decaying old town feel with leathery-faced locals speaking thick dialects, and it never being too far a thing to imagine that dark, salty things could be abroad or even beneath your feet in tunnels and secret places, and that sailors could dredge up things that they'd throw back and only talk about in hushed tones in the Whalebone or Rainers or the Ship Ahoy by lamplight late at night.
And of course,
you always got that kind of sense. Yeah,
there's those awful foreigners on the streets too, which that's the dark side of Lovecraft we do not need to get into today. But I can understand.
I love all that stuff, but yeah, it's not a classic example of Lovecraft, but it's like stuff like The Silver Key and things like that. I don't think are great stories, but I like all that. I like all that over the top Kingsport
Maybe
spires.
best read as sort of prose poems in a way, and then they become a little bit more enjoyable.
Yeah, I think you could reprint some of these stories as gazetteers for a role-playing game or something, unaltered. And it doesn't matter that there's no real story there. All it is 10 pages of overwrought flavour, And I think for that reason, if I'm in the right mood, I can quite happily enjoy them. So, yeah, it's all right. It's all right, but there's better out there. I did find, though, when I pulled out my little Stories of the Dreamland hardcover, that the writing in it was so fucking tiny. I struggled to read it even with my glasses on.
Have you ever got a hold of one of those, what's the company called? The American company, a Library of America. And they do this hardcover omnibus. I have a Le Guin one. It's about 6 novels in one little book, about 2 inches wide, and the print is so small you need a magnifying glass. It's terrible.
Yeah, that's it's not quite as bad as that, but this is like folio size hardback book with all of his Dreamland stories in it, and the text is so densely packed. But anyway, I do have some of the Lovecraft. I think I've got some annotated Lovecraft collections from a few years ago. I didn't even look if it was in there, because they're enormous, and I couldn't be asked to carry a book like this just to read a 10-page short story. So.
Now, I'm not sure if you were still going to go here, but I did spend some time this morning looking on Tidal, which is my streaming service, and I found an album titled House on the Borderland. From about 2016, I think, by an act called Nostalgia. I don't know who that is. It is a concept album about this book. It's got ambient, it's got electronic stuff with beats, and a 1.5-minute piece called Pepper, which for some reason is a folk dance tune stuck in the middle of this dark ambient music. So whoever you are, Nostalgia, congratulations on what sounds like it might not be a bad album. Concept album. Amazing. The other tracks that I found with the title House on the Borderland were mostly really terrible songs by people who couldn't sing and seemed to have nothing to do with this book. So that's my research. But this one album is clearly a concept album.
Yeah. Well, I did look on Bandcamp, and there were loads. But the one that I ended up happening across, and I'm going to have to apologise to the person who actually pointed me at this, because the podcast is on various social media platforms. Sometimes you have conversations with people and then you forget where it was, who it was with, and I feel really guilty. But whoever you were, I do appreciate it, and do drop me a line, because after I hunted around the social media post and I couldn't find it anywhere, but I picked this up on your recommendation. And it's an album called Borderland by Tactile, and originally released in 1999. It's a somber piece of electronica that features the late John Balance of Coil reciting text from the novel over like drone and electronica, including the poem Grief from the end, which we've not mentioned. And it's had a vinyl re-release recently, and so I picked it up from Italy. So Borderlands by Tactile, and you can find this all the tracks of it on YouTube, and one of them is called Grief. The tracks are Grief, Rotation, On the Borders of the Silences, Teratogenic, Do the Dead Stars Make the Green Sun Their Grave, Expulsion, Perichoresis, and track 8 is just called Track 8. So this is it's an interesting album. It's not an everyday album, but if you listen to it in one sitting, it's actually pretty good. It's nice and moody, and the fact that all of the lyrics are John Balance quoting Hope Hodgson from this book, it's quite an interesting album. Yeah, worth a look.
Yes.
Anyway.
Well, as is this album by Nostalgia, which has titles like The Finding of the Manuscript, The Plane of Silence, The House in the Arena, The Thing in the Pit, The Swine Things, Pepper, and so on. So it's in order. You're supposed to be evocative of the... Anyway, I have no idea who that is. I'll have to go look that up.
Well, if you've got a link to it, send me the link and I'll include it in the show notes.
I'll look it up. I'll find out where else it can be found, because I don't know if it's on Bandcamp or any of that.
Perhaps what we'll do is, or perhaps what I'll do when I get a moment is, I'll put together a list of all these Bandcamp House on the Borderlands tracks, and we should listen to them all and we'll do a half-hour supplemental track-by-track review.
Well, you do know there are some music-related themes that we need to explore here on this show.
Yeah, there are, definitely.
Some concept album things.
We have talked about that before, and I think I did send you an image. I picked up the Edgar Winter L. Ron Hubbard Invasion Earth prog rock concept album. And I still haven't listened to it. I'm saving it.
Yeah, I haven't come across that one. We'll probably find more and more of them as we search. Because there was an era where everybody was doing those. Yeah. The last dying throes of prog rock in the late 70s. And that was mainly when that was happening.
Well, apparently L. Ron Hubbard wrote all the lyrics for this album as well.
I can only imagine.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I've been amassing terrible or weird prog rock concept albums based on things like the one based on Chariots of the Gods by Von Daniken, which I picked up from a junk shop
it's the one Bill Bruford was involved in.
That's the one. But, yeah. That's pretty bad. But the only other thing I was going to mention actually was there's a book by Ian Sinclair called Radon Daughters, which came out a few years ago, and it's I'm still yet to read it. But the idea behind that is that there's a guy who lives on the coast and is obsessed with the house that William Hope Hodgson lived in, which was the basis for what he modelled the Recluse's house on the west coast of Ireland. And he becomes obsessed with it. And that's all I know about this book.
There's a book about everything, isn't there?
There really is.
There really is.
Yeah. So I need to check that out. And also there are 2 volumes of short stories influenced by and set in the Nightland, one of which I managed to pick up, but again, I've still not managed to get round to reading.
It's amazing to me that there are people who love that so much that they would do that. I mean, I guess if they listen to this podcast, they'll hate my guts because I wasn't all that complimentary about it. But look, I used it as an epigraph, people. Yeah. I mean, there's some good stuff in there, but I can't see myself wanting to write a story and set in that because it just nothing that's happening in there makes any sense.
I would think that most people who like the Nightland like it from a perspective of tough love.
Yeah, you'd have to.
Yeah,
you would have to. It's so deeply flawed, but amazingly so. Like just the fact that it exists is a good thing.
Yeah. It's incredible how many places you come across it as well. I picked up a role-playing game supplement a year or 2 ago, which was for an existing role-playing game that I think was it was some kind of Cthulhu-based role-playing game, but not the best-known one, Call of Cthulhu by Chaosium. It wasn't that one. Forget the name of the game. But they released a supplement that contained it's like a source book with details on 4 alternative post-apocalyptic weird Earth worlds, to game in, and one of them is a straight adaptation of the Nightland, and because it's in the public domain, they could do it. They could name check Hope Hodgson. They could use all the same terminology, everything like that. So it pops up in the most, unlikely of places when you're least expecting it.
And that's, these writers continue to have life through this stuff. Most of them didn't experience much success in their lifespan. A lot of them died miserable and unknown, but their works live on, and that's. Not to add a dreary postscript to our chat here, but people of today, that's not going to happen to them. I work with all these self-published writers. Because there's so much content now in all the arts. People like me, for example, I've self-published a novel. In 100 years, no one's going to come across that and say what a genius this Thompson was. But we can still do that from people of that area because there weren't really that many books published. And though they're physical copies that people can go into a bookshop and find a dusty old copy of this thing and discover it again. Those times are gone. It makes me feel a little nostalgic. But for people like Hope Hodgson and David Lindsay and all those sorts of people, it gives their work new life. Hopefully they're happy out there in the green sun, wherever they are now, the golden bubbles.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. Bless him. What a fucking ending he had. Terrible.
Yeah, like so many of his generation.
Yeah. Anyway, on that, thank you for coming on to talk about House on the Borderland, because we had this on our Halloween poll 2 years running, and it never got voted through. So on this occasion, for our period of Halloween self-indulgence, when we just decide to look at what I generally Guy and Smith novels, which tend to get voted top, and that's happened again this year.
Wow. I think we really got to the heart of what this book is about. I think we achieved something with this one.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. So thanks again.
Thank
hopefully
you.
We'll get together again in 2025 and do the Voyage to Arcturus.
I guarantee it. Get reading.
Massive thanks to Allister once again for returning to Derry and Tom's to talk about The House on the Borderland. You can find Allister's music at thegatelessgate.bandcamp.com, and his debut novel, The Music of the Spheres, is available now. If you want some insight into that, we talked about it on this very podcast a couple of years ago. And of course, check out our previous sojourns together, looking at the War of the Worlds and The Land That Time Forgot. If you're interested in more Hodgson ruminations, I can recommend Voices from the Borderland by Hippocampus Press, a collection of essays that look pretty deeply at his life and output. We briefly touched upon Hodgson's encounter with Houdini, and I might have said it took place in Bolton, but in actuality it was Blackburn, and there is an extensive essay on the Blackburn encounter and its impact on both men in Voices from the Borderland by Sam Gafford. It's excellent and offers a good insight into both men. Hodgson, after being bullied at sea as a teen, became a bodybuilder, or, in the nomenclature of the time, a student of physical culture. In fact, later opening his own school of physical culture in Blackburn, with many local police being his students. And after the local constabulary felt humiliated by a touring Houdini escaping their bindings in 15 minutes, the history goes that Hodgson's students enlisted him to challenge Houdini for the £25 prize, which, Hodgson stated, would be paid to the local infirmary should he be triumphant over the escapologist. The story's lengthy and has a few twists and turns, but suffice to say that in the years afterwards, Houdini remained pretty sore about it all. And Gafford's essay says, Houdini would return to the Blackburn area several times and, in 1911, he visited Burnley in Lancashire, which was nearby. As usual, he made the rounds of the local papers and, when interviewed by the Burnley Express on April the 15th, would claim his most nerve-wracking ordeal was undergone at Blackburn in 1902, where a physical culture expert so manacled him that he was 2 hours in releasing himself, and then his bleeding arms and wrists testified to the punishment he had gone through. When interviewed for the Hull Daily Mail in 1914, Houdini discussed retiring because his health was suffering from his many escape feats, and mention is made once again of the Blackburn incident. The confrontation had begun to take on a life of its own, even outliving both of its participants. Given our musings over the female character in The House on the Borderland, there's also an interesting essay included that makes a study of Hodgson's attitude to women in his stories, although it focuses upon the nightland mostly, as well as a handful of short stories, and doesn't mention the recluse's sister at all. If you're interested in Hodgson, Voices from the Borderland is a really excellent book and I recommend it. In other news, I got a notification from the Mastodon app the other day. To be honest, I'd forgotten I had it installed. I hadn't looked at it for about 18 months, but it turns out there is life there. D. Kilroy, the Dead End Kid, said, "Loved the Bastable pre-game chat. One of my favourite books was Mother London, but if I had to point to my essential shelf, it's Breakfast in the Ruins, Adventures of Una and Catherine Cornelius, the complete JC short stories including Maldine's comics, and The English Assassin. I feel like all that led up to me being ready for Dahlgren. The imagination on display in all those books is anarchic in the truest sense. One day I'd like to hear you kids have a go at Dahlgren. That would be a lovely wide-ranging talk, and also the Moorcock aficionado's feelings about Delaney's craft." Well, as you've asked, I'll add Samuel R. Delany to the to-do list. He's been dancing around my peripheral vision for years, but I've never properly investigated, and I know he's held in very high regard, so thank you, D. Kilroy, the Dead End Kid, for the thoughts and feedback. And patron Nick Hopkinson has requested Ursula K. Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea too, and I haven't read that since my teens. Add to that 9 Princes in Amber, requested by Steve Round countless aeons ago, and we have a lot to chew over. But first, we have some Moorcock to catch up on, so that will be our focus post-spooky season. But we'll look at some of those in the new year, no doubt. And thanks as always to our patrons for keeping this show on the road. First, those without tier: Anthony Piconti, Tim Cardos, Dave Dempster, and Sebastian Weetabix. And our Chaos Engineers: Aid von Stout, Andrew Cicluna, Andrew Spong, Andrew Van Ness, Anthony Porter, Benjamin Fletcher, Brandon Mays, Dan Charnley, Dave Griffiths, Dave Voxman, Gabriel Laycock, Harvey Faulkner Aston, Jim Kirkland, Jim Jupp, John W. Lays, Jules Lawrence, Mal Pertwee, Matt Saltz, Nick Hopkinson, Ofer Ziv, Paul McRandall, PJ Cooper, Scott Butler, Simon Perrins, and new to the bunk room on the Donblass, Ben Hagar. Thanks for the support, Ben. And of course to our crafty Jugaderos, Christian Hundal, Graham Holden, Liam Turner, Loz, Mark Taylor, Matthew Broom, Sean Twist, Toby White, and Taylor Lavery. And eternal thanks to our patron demons, Alistair Davison, Andy Clark, Andy Darby, David Lee, Fred Quiche, Gareth Wilson, Glenn Sawyer, Greg Faulkner, Gwen Barlow, Ian Stead, Imria, Janie Stim, Jason Vogel, Joe Monty, Jonathan Sharp, Lee Gary, Mark Hebden, Marius Latauskas, Miles Riedel-Batto, Neil Burton, Paul Hillary, Randall Gatlin, Steve Round, Tom Murphy, Tony Malazzo, the OG patron, Norman Beresford, and last, but of course never least, Robert McMillan. Okay, enough of my yakking. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BreakfastRuins. And because Twitter is pretty much dead on its feet these days, and if you're that way inclined, you can find me on Mastodon and Blue Sky where I'm Stimbot5000. Don't ask, it's the early days of the interwebs thing that has stuck around. You can email us at breakfastruins@outlook.com. The webpage is breakfastintheruins.com. BITR Breakfast in the Ruins Radio is live on Radio Garden or via the web player at breakfastintheruinsradio.blogspot.com. We have our Patreon page too, and there are a few extra odds and sods on there. But for now, take care, stay safe, and we will meet again soon on the Moonbeam Roads.
My whole brain has but one thought. breast is one whole raging pain. For that which was, and now is flown into the blank where life is hurled.